welcome Elin Björling. Elin is a research scientist at the University of Washington in Seattle, affiliated with the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department. She is also the co-founder of the Momentary Experience Lab, which focuses on capturing real-world experiences that people have with tools around them, including robots. Over the past decades, Elin studied adolescent health using mixed methods and new technologies from a participatory design perspective. Her research has focused primarily on using ecological momentary assessment to study stress in teenagers. Elin has really an immense experience with teenagers, and before she also studied headaches in teenage girls. But Elin's experience is vast and broader than this. She traveled around the world, living in places in Asia and in Europe, like Paris. She learned a lot about good coffee. And Elin is just a very interesting person. She has a dance background, and she's also a foster animal mom and has rescued many puppies and cats in the need of care. So basically, Elin is an incredible human being who I'm very happy to have met and to be work closely to. And now get ready, because today she will talk about how qualitative methods will save us from designing the wrong robot. So I will give Elin space.
All right, thank you. All right, let's see if we can get this squeezed in. And it's nice to see so many familiar faces. All right, I had my slides up already, so I have to escape and go back and reshare. Yeah, I'm very appreciative to be here, and especially to be part of this platform. This kind of thing is exactly what I think we need to be doing in robotics in general, is getting together and having these important conversations. So that was enough of an introduction, so enough about me. I'll just add, reach out if you have any questions. I'm going to try to do what I'm calling like a 30,000-foot drop, where we're going to try to talk about qualitative methods in robotics and my particular project as a use case. But in only 20 to 30 minutes, I can really only give you so much. So with that, know that there are so many resources and spaces to go to get more information if this is an area of interest. All right, so you probably know, because of the space that we're in, what I kind of call the rise and the fall of social robots, and this idea that there is clearly an inclination to design social robots. We clearly have some reasoning behind this about why we think this is a good idea. But in terms of social robots, we've seen a lot of robots that have a very particular design and work very well for a population, and then robots that are sort of designed to be social companions that have kind of failed on the market, so to speak. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider as we think about all social robots and the intentions behind them. So this first section is sort of about why in the world are we designing social robots, and where does this inclination come from? And I think it's super important to keep asking this question, even those of us who are designing at each stage of the design or research, sort of why are we doing this? What is the overall intention and the purpose? So one big question that I think is outstanding and should remain sort of an academic conversation from now until the end of time is, do humans want or need social robots? It makes me nervous if we just operate under the assumption that we do. So my current kind of answer to this question is that it depends, right? There isn't a straightforward answer to whether or not we need or want social robots. It really is going to depend. The population that we're working with has told us a lot. Teenagers have told us a lot about when and where a social robot is appropriate. So that context really matters. It also matters on sort of like these internal and external contexts going on with the humans that we're designing for or that we're researching. So who are these users? Human beings are very different and come from all kinds of different cultures and populations. So who the users are, where are these users? How do they feel about the robot? That's a really important question that has to do with whether or not they need it or like it or want to use it. Who designed the robot? This is also part of the context of an individual robot that is going to help us determine whether or not that person likes or wants to use the robot. And then what's the role of the robot? Is the robot supporting them in something they're already trying to do? Is it assistive technology? Is the robot entertainment? Is the robot companionship? These are all really important questions that come back to this concept of it depends whether or not we need a social robot and whether we should be designing them. Context is so important. So all of that it depends comes back to context. A robot that's very, very successful with small children, that in that context, this is a beautiful device, really successful. This is MIT's cute little robot for 4 and 5-year-olds. Might be absolutely repulsive in other contexts, okay? So again, we have to sort of look at who we're designing for, what is the context of those individuals, and not just assume globally that a social robot is appropriate or correct. Every time anyone asks me anything at all about social robots, I come back to this sort of space of it really depends on what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're designing, who you're designing it for. So if we then agree that context matters as we go about designing and researching social robots, that the context really matters, I suddenly find we end up in the qualitative methodology. And I'll explain to you kind of why that is. But if we want to assume that this context is a really important component of what we're trying to do and why we're doing what we do, to ignore that context as we go about working on the design or the research seems very counterintuitive. So when we think about qualitative methods, which again, I'll wrap up why that has to do with context, but I love this quote that the world is actually made up of stories. So in social robotics, and again, I still feel fairly new to this discipline or this field, coming from kind of health sciences and psychology background. But in social robotics, there's a real drive for measurement. And I kind of joke, yes, we'll measure gaze. Of course we'll measure gaze, because I feel like the most studies or reviewers are kind of like, yeah, you showed engagement and people felt this way, but did you measure gaze? Like, do you have any concrete objective measures of what you're doing? And I think there are very appropriate places and reasons why we want those objective measures. We want those measurements. We want to look at mechanisms and outcomes and effect. But there's this other space that we're in that's contextual and that has to do with the individual and their history and their external and internal contexts. And that's where I come back to this idea of the world in the end is kind of made up of stories. Even our social robot is starting to have a story and a context in terms of how it was developed. And so this quote and this idea of thinking about the story being an important part of the research is where I see qualitative methods and qualitative methodologies just streamline basically or intersect with social robotics research and design. So this is where I wish I could spend an hour with you guys. If you are feeling like you wish you understood more about qualitative methods, or you're wondering about what you're doing or whether it's empirical. And so this is going to be very short and brief. But one of my drive home points often when I'm talking about qualitative methodologies is this idea that anybody can run a qualitative method. Anybody can do an interview with a user and let them talk and record it and transcribe it and so forth. You can watch a video of an interaction with a human and a robot, and that's qualitative data that we've captured. You could even analyze it. You could even code it up based on somebody's rigorous method. That isn't enough. So running a qualitative method does not make you a qualitative researcher. And what I want to try to impress upon you is that moving yourself into a qualitative methodology, which means the framework that you're coming from actually is a qualitative lens, that's what's going to make a huge difference in terms of your research, in terms of your design of your robot, in terms of the way you go about seeing what you're looking at in front of you, is to have that qualitative lens. So a lot of times, and for those of you, especially who are students, I apologize because the qualitative discipline has a terrible, terrible way of mixing up what we call a method, what we call a methodology. So when you pick up any book, even a good text, some of these terminologies are overlapping and it's very confusing. So that's on all of us in qualitative research to do a better job to be more clear about that. But the way I distinguish this is a methodology is a lens you're wearing, it's a procedure you're following, it's a series of events that isn't just the method, and the method needs to stem from that methodology. So the methods are unlimited. The number of qualitative methods that you could use are really unlimited at this point. But if you don't hold that methodology in place, if you don't have a sort of rigorous plan and an appropriate lens when you're going about to do the work, you really won't get nearly as much from that qualitative interview. Okay, so that I'm going to jump through these. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them. But one thing that happens when we wear that qualitative lens is we absorb and assume these sort of qualitative premises. Okay, so these are the assumptions that I'm operating under as I go about any work qualitatively. Plurality simply means, literally comes back to like, there are multiple truths within people, across people. Your experience is your experience, and I'm not looking for objectivity. I'm not looking to prove which thing happened. I've got 2 users, they had completely different experiences. Both of those have some truth to it and can be part of the research. Subjectivity, I'm sure you've run into this, but in qualitative methods, we assume subjectivity. What's known, everybody knows, we assume some subjectivity on the part of the participant. We also assume subjectivity on the part of the researcher. It's impossible for me to not be subjective, no matter how hard I try. And again, that goes back to that idea, if we believe the world's made up of stories, I've got data with me as I go about my work. We also assume that data emerge as we're going about our work. So people have their beliefs about robots, but when I put them in front of a robot and have them interact, something has already started changing. And the data I'm gathering are those emergent data that happen during that interaction. Reality is constructed. So this is a wild idea, but maybe really appropriate for the era that we're living in right now. But that in many ways, we each are constructing a reality in front of us as we go about what we're doing. So there is no constant in that space. And then finally, the data and their context, and this is what we're going to talk about a little bit more, but data and their context are inextricably linked. And I mean inextricably, that the data emerging as I do something has everything to do with the context that we are in as that data shows up. So the only 2 things I can get to in this short time are a little bit about subjectivity, and then I really want to dive a little bit into this context idea. So if we assume participants and researchers are both subjective, in a quantitative lens, when we're trying to get empirical and objective evidence, we are trying so hard to pretend this isn't true. I'm going to say it again and again, but it is true. Even as I'm looking at quant data, I have some subjectivity. It's really not really possible for me to not be me as I'm analyzing any kind of data. The beauty of qualitative is we're going to go ahead and say that out loud, that we are subjective, and we're going to embrace that as part of the methodology. The fact that my participants are very subjective as well. They see, hear, and feel things very differently from one another because that's their subjective experience. And then the same is true for us as researchers. As I watch an interaction, I replay a video, I discuss it with others on my team, we are having different experiences about what we're seeing. We don't always have to agree on what's happening. We can have richer, more elaborate data that says maybe both of these things are happening. Okay. And then this concept that data and design are embedded in these contexts. So sort of what I said before about the environment. the number of papers I've reviewed in robotics where they say such and such happened and there was this level of engagement and users reported this afterwards and the device was very effective. And I'm often reading a study saying, but where were they? Where were they when this happened? Were they in a lab? Were these guys in their nursing home in their own area? Were they in a public space? Environment is one of the contexts that heavily weighs in on the experience you're having and even whether or not something might be effective. The user beliefs. Again, this is a psychology part of me, but I'm always very interested in what users believe. Am I afraid of robots? Have I been afraid of robots my whole life? And do you know about that? Are you aware of that before we have this interaction with a robot? Familiarity, this isn't very much a thing right now because most people haven't interacted with social robots, but in 10 years, we're gonna wanna know what kinds of robots have you interacted with before and what were those experiences like? And then just simple questions like, how am I feeling? Am I having the worst day of my life as I come into this interaction? Am I highly stressed? So these are all contexts that really are important and weigh into sort of the experience. So here's an example where the robot context really seemed to matter. But we often show robots to teenagers. We ask them what they think about their appearance and so on and so forth. And a teen said to me in a high school where we brought these robots, Curie really creeps me out. That's the one in the middle. It's so large and has those creepy round eyes, and I would not want that robot. She was so confident in this. She was like, that one, no. And teens, they're always very confident in what they say. And they're beautifully explicit about not trying to please you. And you don't have to hear this audio. But basically, she then interacted with the robot. And that's Curie's cute little behavior, right? It squeaks, it has a purring effect, it has all these haptics on board. And then she says, oh my gosh, that's so cute. I just love it. This one is my favorite one. So I said to her, but I noticed before that you said this was the creepiest one and you didn't want to have anything to do with it. And she said, yeah, but I didn't know it would feel like that. So in my office, if I ever am back there again, I have this big Post-it with her quote that says, yeah, but I didn't know it would feel like that, hanging on my whiteboard, because I sort of think that is probably the most important contextual piece of data, that humans don't necessarily know how they're going to feel, and then how they feel changes what's happening in that interaction or where they stand in terms of robots. So a qualitative approach is going to help us understand how and why. It's going to help us explore new territory, capture these contexts, and most importantly, allow for this rich kind of experiential data of human beings are creating these stories, having these interactions, and that can inform the research and our design. So I'm going to just give you a view of how we've done this in our particular case. I'm just going to basically throw a bunch of methods out there so you can just sort of see this in action. But again, there's tons more information about our project and what we've done. So EMAR, which I won't get into huge details about, but this is our social robot. It's named after ecological momentary assessment. And our big picture question was sort of how might we design a social robot to improve teen mental health? And remember, underneath that question is always, do we need a social robot to improve teen mental health? And I don't know. We're 6 years into this. I'm not sure, but we have to go through this procedure to find out. What should the robot look like? How should the robot behave? These are really important questions in almost any robot space. And again, this is where I see us needing to take the context into account more often, that we can't just make a thing and deploy it in a bunch of different spaces. Ideally, we're making a thing that is designed specifically for that population and for its purpose, so the design and the robot's behaviors are congruent. So the intention behind EMAR, and this is through years of co-design with teenagers, is that it's going to live in a public high school, gather anonymous stress and mood data, while providing a micro intervention, like a 3-minute intervention to help you with your stress level or your mood, allow you to sort of verbalize some stuff that's bothering you. And then it's going to reflect data back to that community. So it'll be a community-based tool. So the way we've used so many different qualitative methods on this project to inform design, I want to comment that there's often this dualism of the quantitative method is empirical, meaning it's really reliable, it's repeatable, we can trust the data, and that somehow qualitative ends up in this murky area. And I want to argue that when you are using the qualitative lens and the methodology, your qualitative methods can also be empirical. Oh, sorry. So this is an example of sketching as a qualitative method. I'm trying to elicit, I'm trying to get inside these humans and understand, what do you think about when I say, what about a robot to help you with your stress? And you just think about that and sketch. What are you seeing? What can you imagine? Ideate with me. These are really important data that are also kind of all over my office. Script writing. You have a conversation with a robot. What might you share with that robot? What might you tell them? So we actually had teens write the script to have with a robot, and then other teens could either read that script or use their own data to interact with a robot. Storyboarding. In order to gather ideas of robot interactions, or more importantly, interactions that we want to be wary of. What are teens worried about might happen with a robot? And then interviews. Although we do interactive group interviews where we have a couple of teens interacting with a device, and then we interview them about that experience and have them talk through what they liked and disliked, how it made them feel, what they can imagine. But we're giving them things in that moment to interact with. So they're speaking almost from an expertise of, oh, I just saw the robot say that, and I'm looking at its belly screen, and now here's how I feel as I answer these questions you have. Photo elicitation, which I showed earlier, that's how we got those Post-its about the stalker robot Pepper. Another one of my favorites is on the Pepper robot, a teen wrote, looks more like a peeper. So again, all of the data we got from simple photo elicitation told us right away, no white robots and no like AI or humanoid. Right out of the gate, within just 2 months of work, we absolutely knew we were heading away from that kind of a design. And then we've also used the qualitative method of prototyping through co-design and allowing participants and teenagers to make things and getting data out of, like, what did you make? We learned through co-design that we needed to not have a single robot. The ways in which teens envisioned the robot that really is going to help them were so diverse that we knew we had to come up with more of a platform than a single robot design. And then the other thing we do is sort of these interaction data, where again, think about the qualitative lens and my interest in capturing the context. We often use 360 cameras.
Hi, robot. I've been feeling really stressed out lately. My classes are difficult and my grades.
So in this context, he's choosing to read that script that another teenager wrote that they felt was like an authentic thing that someone might tell a robot. And then here we are watching a teen interact, and there are other teens in the room sitting here witnessing that interaction. In this case, they're giggling, and we're capturing what it's like for them to witness a teen having this interaction. This is the context we are talking about, is the school environment. There will be other teens around. So having these interaction scenarios play out, asking them how they felt talking to a robot in front of other teens, is all really important contextual data for this project. All right, so in summary, the qualitative approach, I think, is essential to understand the human experience that's going on between a human-robot interaction. If we are working with, yes, we're working with robots, if we're also going to work with humans, we had better get really skilled at how we're capturing that human experience. And I will always argue it's an empirical and valid approach to research, in which the context is going to be imperative for our meaning making and our decisions about design and further research and so forth. All right, so what this led to was, for EMAR, we needed to end up with a very customizable platform that now we're busy playing with all kinds of different ways we can customize it, because we couldn't design one singular robot. We know that each of our communities are going to need to create a robot that has the right embodiment for that community, and even potentially the right behaviors. So we end up with this very, very flexible system became our design answer to that question of how would the robot behave and what would it look like if we wanted it to help teens with their mental health. All right. So in summary, this is my model for today, for you today to take home and consider. But again, my argument is sort of this idea that the qualitative lens, not just the method, but that qualitative methodology that's going to include subjectivity and include this embedded context is what we're going to need in order to design successful robots. It's going to save us from making a thing that doesn't work for that population. So this is like a protective measure, if you will, that if you have some qualitative methodology on board, you're much more likely to get to your robot design or even robot experiment that makes sense. Okay, and last, I will say that this whole project now in year 5 or 6 has involved a lot of people, a lot of amazing students. My co-PIs, now Patricia is on board. This is not work that somebody does by themselves. So I feel like it's really important to kind of give you this idea of what a large project it is. And again, we wouldn't be nearly as far along as we are without so many great students joining us and bringing their own subjective experience to the processes and the analyses and so forth. All right. My very last slide, I told Patricia this morning, I was like, I'm going to put a little quiz up at the end of this, a qualitative quiz, so we can open this as opening to discussion if you guys want. But here's something I face pretty much every day, is this type of situation. Reviewer number 2, let's just call it reviewer number 2 because that's the meme, says, isn't the teen speaking to the robot heavily influenced by the other teens around them? So when I say, hey, we had this interaction and this is the effect we got, we noticed that stress was greatly reduced in 90 some teens who interacted with the robot. And they say, yeah, but this robot was in a school setting. And so there were probably lots of other things going on that could have led to this happening, this stress being reduced. You can never say that it was just the robot, right? And they're looking at it as an experimental question. And the qualitative data are getting in the way of that objective requirement with experimental methods. So I can leave this open, or I can show you my short response to this question, or hide it and give it to you all later. But this is something I face all the time that comes right back to this concept of context. What do you think? Should I share my response? We can discuss my response.
Whatever you think it's better. We can also wait to see if someone has an idea and then.
Okay.
Prefer.
All right, we'll put it out there. How do you feel? How do you think to respond to reviewer number 2 if their criticism is that the other teens in this setting are influencing the potential measurement or effect of the robot?
And yeah, we have formally opened the Q&A with this, so feel free to jump in. If I can say something, I think just as a note, I think it's very important, just the question by the value, the power that it has in the robotics field. It's generally, we don't see papers or research about bystanders, and we are just like in social context everywhere. We don't live isolated in Mars with a robot. So the power of bystanders in this research and in this question is really interesting. I would love to see what others also think. Stefania also is saying, aren't teens in the chat, aren't teens always influenced by their peers? So that's the first one. And then Sadat says, I believe it's true. I think humans in general are very much influenced by the people they are surrounded with. Megumi says, in real life, teens are influenced by their peers. It actually gives more reliable data because it's representative of their context. That's interesting as well.
That's a beautiful way to say it. So I'll share. So I would say something like, by conducting this study in the wild, which allows for all those variables, we allow for numerous uncontrolled variables. So again, you can think about this quantitatively like, oh no, those are confounds. But with a qualitative lens, we're saying those variables are essential to adding this contextual validity to what we're doing. So there will be teens around these other teens while they're interacting with the robot. And there will be an exam that just happened last period that the person failed that totally changes the effect of the robot on them in that moment, either positive or negative, that I don't even know about. So again, I think that there's an argument to be made, especially for social robots, that this qualitative lens actually helps us to do a better job of recognizing and acknowledging all of these contextual variables that are going to be going on in the real world for human beings as we go about robots. All right, so you guys got an A. That was some really good answers to that.
Yeah.
Okay, what else? Oh,
I want first, Elin, to thank you really much for this amazing presentation. So I just wanted to also take the time for that and invite anyone that has questions for Elin to engage in a discussion. Any questions about the presentation, any questions from your own research, questions about the methods, or just the field are welcome. Carly, if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this great talk. It's super interesting. And I'm also a qualitative researcher, and with a qualitative lens, I would even say like a feminist researcher theory lens. And I'm wondering how, you know, in the spirit of responding to reviewer number 2, how you respond to the comment about generalizability, which almost always, you know, we get in qualitative research. We are rarely using samples that are like in the thousands and 10,000s, the way that quantitative research can be. And there are some other researchers who basically think like, unless you have an N of 10,000, is not useful data, you know, at all, right? I remember I once gave a talk, and right afterwards, the speaker said, okay, this is interesting, but very small samples, so, you know, whatever. So I'm wondering how you respond to this comment of generalized.
So, and I can share with you guys, there's a beautiful Twitter thread about sample size. Oh shoot, now I can't think of her last name, Kakali. She goes by Queen Bee on Twitter, but she's a wonderful qual researcher. And she did this nice thread that really kind of sums it up. But basically, when we use the word generalizability, we are talking about experimental methods. So this is an example where our language locks us in to kind of, when I ask you to talk about generalizability with your qualitative study, I'm actually making like a completely incongruent argument of like, I want you to talk over here, even though what you did came from over here, because these are very different things. So again, generalizability literally goes back to the concept of objectivity in experimental methods. The language that we use, and we all need to keep using in qualitative methods, is about transference. So what we do is we do a study with any number of people, and we're looking for the right number based on the research question and based on context. So that number could be 1 or that number could be 74. It just depends on what you're working on. But the data from that study may be transferable to other spaces, to other projects, to other populations. But you don't create qualitative research that is inherently transferable. You create research that's so transparent and so well done that I can look at your research and say, hey, there's some real similarities here, and I'm going to transfer some of your findings and include them over here in what I'm doing. That's not generalizability. We are never trying to generalize about the larger population. I'm never grabbing 64 teens and saying, since I got 64, and since they were these ages, and from these different like cultural backgrounds, I've now created a generalizable sample. And actually, I'm not really sure generalization makes that much sense. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But that's where we need to start moving more to using qual language when we're defending qualitative work. So then the term transferability comes into play. Good question, and one of the most common problems of qual work.
Carmina, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, I hope the camera is showing. Well,
yeah.
The thing is, well, first of all, a really nice presentation, and I'm happy to have met actually Talking Robotics. I think it's a great initiative. Well, just to tell you a bit about myself, I received my PhD at the University of Amsterdam, and now I'm focusing on social robotics, and I back in my homeland, Chile, where I'm leading now a qualitative study in schools with children, together with Ricardo. He's I think online somewhere in this chat. And well, it's one of my first qualitative studies in the area of social robotics. So we plan to present different types of robot designs to children. And so I have a really methodological question, which might be simple, but I've been thinking how to go around this, and that is the issue of like having a camera like records the children's reactions or the children's kinetic language or body language, and not to even mention that here we're still in the COVID mode, so children are going to be wearing a mask. How to go around that and have the camera feel a little bit like, I mean, in the context, for instance, in your studies, when the teens are talking to the robot, they don't usually have a camera also filming them, you know, so that feels a bit unnatural. But on the other hand, I think that recording gives such a power to us, the researchers, to later, you know, transcribe and analyze. So that would be like if you would have maybe a tip of how to like incorporate the camera in a way that's kind of natural, in a way, and that feels like in the context. And secondly, I actually was like reading your paper about your teen study, and you talk a lot about the novelty effect that happens. And yeah, for us it's the same. Like, I mean, how do you know if it's like really the robot design that's causing a certain reaction or comment or inner experience, or is it, you know, that's just so new to children that can be a confounding effect? And again, here then I'm using more of a quantitative term, but you know what I mean. So if you could perhaps these two things, you know, that's what I wanted to know.
Yeah. I'll go in reverse order. So as far as the novelty effect, again, I think it probably is a thing. How measurable is it? I don't know. It's a pretty complicated, like contextual variable, right? So I think the way I think about it is if you have a short-term study, you're going to have to hold the novelty effect as a potential limitation, right? Everywhere I go, I could say, but it could have just been like that because they got to get out of class and come talk to a robot, or whatever. There's all these potential things that could be limiting whether or not that would happen in the wild. But the real way around the novelty effect is longitudinal deployment. So like that's really, and one of our jokes on EMAR is like, a researcher once said to me, oh, I would never work with teens. Aren't they just going to throw your robot down the stairs eventually, like when you're not looking? And so I joke like, well, eventually we need this 3-month deployment to find out if the robot's going to be thrown down the stairs or not. That's the only way to really answer that question. So like even the concept and the nuance of novelty is really difficult to tease out. So I think, yes, there's always some novelty effect going on unless you have a real longitudinal deployment and you can sort of check that box and say, well, it can't possibly be novel now because they've been interacting with it for 2 or 3 months. But otherwise, we just have to assume that, again, that's one of the contexts at play that's really hard to tease out, whether that's the reason or this is the reason. And then back to your question about cameras. I do think as a qualitative researcher, and the reason we use 360 camera is it's really important to have the best understanding we can of the full context in that moment. Over the years, we've used sort of static single, 2D camera, and somebody's talking and then you hear laughing and you don't know like if that person behind them touched them or was that. And so I just feel with the 360 camera, I have a lot more understanding of the nature of that situation. Again, very subjective. I can only see what I can see. And one thing I've found with teenagers is recording is just not an issue. we have over 420 participants, and I don't think any single one of them has, maybe one, but I think it was actually related to a parent consent, has said, I do not want to be recorded. So one upside of the constant phone, you know, Instagram, whatever life, is that having a camera sit next to me is probably not even distracting. And like our 360 cameras are very small. We are, however, really transparent about our research setup. So here's the robot, here's how it's operated. I'm going to put this camera here. It's a 360 camera, so I can kind of capture what's going on in the room during this interaction. But I do think you want to try to get that data as best as you can. And as for masks and whatever, that's why you need even more data, right? Even a better view around the room, because you have less that you can tell from the facial expression, maybe with masks on. It's all an experiment and improvisation.
I hadn't thought of the 360 camera, so I think this is fantastic. Thanks so much.
I'm a huge fan. Oh, yeah, there's some caveats to that, but yeah.
Thank you. I will just grab a question from the chat because I feel it's generable enough and can be used for many people. Joe asks, what has been the most interesting or productive co-design or participatory design method for you?
We've done so, I mean, now we're doing them digitally. It depends on productive. That's a hard word for me. I'm surprised how efficient storyboarding is as a form of co-design. So I will say that, like, you gain quite a lot for very little time and effort. So we've had in many different situations, teenagers collaboratively, and I always, because they're teenagers, because they're inherently social, all of our methods are social. So 2 or 3 of them collaborate to create a storyboard. And here's another qual hot tip: record them creating their storyboard, because that's how data is elicited as they're having these conversations. No, dude, that would be so stupid if the robot did that. Wouldn't that be creepy? That wouldn't be creepy. That's some of your best data, is the conversation going on while they're in an activity. But storyboarding, if you look at all of our storyboards, and somewhere we have somebody who started drafting a storyboard paper, because now we have a good 200 storyboards about robots and teens. They tell you an awful lot through storyboarding. So it's just very efficient. Like, we learn a lot in those kinds of easy to do designs, and the only materials you need are paper or even like digital platforms where they can click and cut and paste things. So I think that's the most efficient. Effective, I can't answer because it has to do with what question we're after.
Great, thank you. There is Soyeon also with a question.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I had so this summer I'm like planning to do a co-design with older adults with MCI, and trying to do some gamification on some activities, but I haven't very much interacted with older adults, especially with mild cognitive impairment. So prior to co-designing, what are some ways to get a better understanding of the population that it will help you kind of design or kind of develop the design process more in an effective way? Yeah.
I think 2 things. One, find somebody, anybody, and I'm always like, don't be shy. I'm always borrowing, stealing, asking for help from anybody I can. So find somebody who is currently doing co-design with adults, specifically in that population with cognitive impairment. Because that's also a subjective and contextual space that when you go in with some kind of like contextual knowledge about this population and about previous experiences co-designing with them, that will just help you as a researcher stay focused with your qualitative lens. So I would think about that, and then just really co-design. And I've only worked with teens in co-design, but there are a lot of good resources about how to be ready and to be flexible is something really important in co-design, so that in the moment, with whatever sample you end up with, you can be responsive to that sample by switching up your method a little or giving them more time or quickly finding a different material that's helpful for one person. So I also think whenever we're talking about co-design, there's that be ready to be improvisational and flexible in the moment to ensure that the method is working for your participants. But there are some good people doing work, co-design specifically. So I would just be sure you're linking arms with anybody who's out there and been doing this for a little while to see what they learned about the process.
Yeah, definitely. There are other people in the lab doing this work together, but yeah, it definitely like working with a specific population, like how to approach it differs.
I will say one
thank
other
you.
thing that I say about teens all the time, but it's really true for all participants, is when we move into these, and you're now in kind of participatory methods, we really want the participants to be the experts. So kind of the nice thing is in a co-design session, you're really just like a facilitator. You're just helping them to express themselves and letting them have expertise. So they may even have expertise about the method. And that's where I like to offer choice of like, we could do this 3 different ways. Talk to them when you get there. What do you think? What's more comfortable? Would you like to do it this way? And someone else does it this way, and just providing them with choice and the ability to make decisions in that moment to suit their needs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Sure.
Stefania, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for the talk, Ellen. It was so inspiring. I was specifically interested in the participatory Wizard of Oz method that you used. I read your paper about it and loved it. And I wonder if you thought about how to conduct this or use this method online. Would it be possible to do a participatory Wizard of Oz online in case we cannot do that in person for various reasons? Thank you.
Yeah. And hi, Stefania. Yeah, I think so. And we've talked about this actually, if COVID continues. I will say that to me, participatory Wizard of Oz, again, was a creative method we came up with, kind of because of our tenets with working with teenagers and wanting to always be transparent and never to be deceptive at all. And then also this wild idea that if I'm so interested in my participants and them helping us to co-design this robot, why would I be the one to create these interactions? Like, why wouldn't I be inviting them to actually create the robot behaviors that others could witness and weigh in on and so forth? So that's kind of where the participatory Wizard of Oz idea came from. We are currently after an active listening sort of interaction. That's what we're really focused on. And we have talked about how our particular system would be capable of a Wizard of Oz. We had to do it ourselves, where Patricia is controlling the robot and someone else is in the lab with the robot. So that sort of proves that point of like, oh, this would be feasible, but what data would I need as the operator is kind of an interesting research question. But I think absolutely, and sort of getting at that. We've also toyed with the idea of this kind of like the digital mask is what we call it kind of in VR, but that maybe having a teen operator. So I know I'm actually talking to a teen when I'm talking to the robot, or that a teen is hearing me, but I don't know who that person is because we have this digital mask between us. So you could imagine testing some of those scenarios of like, how does it feel to know that you're talking to another teenager, but you're kind of both remaining anonymous and you're allowed to kind of share and express how you feel. So that's another space where that Wizard of Ozing remotely would make a lot of sense. So the teen wouldn't be in the other room. They would literally be who knows where. But I know when I'm interacting with this robot that there's a teen behind the interaction. There's a human being in the loop. And so that's something we're very interested in exploring. My hypothesis is that could be really effective, just using the robot as the mask, so to speak.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ellen, and everyone who asked questions. There are many more questions in the chat, and I think we will just keep going. So I will invite everyone to, first of all, applaud Ellen's talk and really thank Ellen for this time together. And if you have more questions, Ellen is part of our Slack space, and you will be able to engage there with her. So just join us there. The link is in the chat. and you can pose your question and there will be an answer when Elin has time. And so I am just going to wrap up and really share with you some exciting things. So our next session will have Kate Darling present The New Breed, a book that she wrote. So be sure to read the book before the session. It's on the 20th of August. So you will have plenty of time during the summer. Support us in Buy Me a Coffee if you like this initiative and want to support our Zoom space, for example. We have to thank Animatas as well, has been sponsoring us. And enjoy the summer. We will break here. And this was our last session before August 20th. So thank you so much for being with us and have a great summer.